now call this hearing to order, and I want to thank all our witnesses and guests here, and my good friend and colleague, Dr. Ehlers, for being here. I want to also thank staff for their outstanding work in putting this hearing together. I'm especially excited about today's hearing because it sets the groundwork for a number of hearings that I hope to hold in this committee, looking at how the social sciences can help us address some of the most difficult challenges we face in our country today. Energy, in my opinion, ranks among our country's top 3 challenges, next to health and national security. Solving our nation's energy challenges will depend on a combination of technological innovation and behavior changes. This committee and this Congress have held countless hearings on the energy technologies tomorrow. What we don't talk about often enough is behavior and how changes in behavior can start making a big dent in our energy challenge today. Whereas we talk about the technologies of tomorrow, behavior could help us make the changes today. The panel sitting before us will give us insight into how we might achieve this goal. One witness will tell us how a simple change in a written message to hotel guests asking them to reuse their towels could save 39 barrels of oil and 72,000 gallons of water in one hotel in 1 year. If you multiply that by all the hotels in all the cities in this country, that adds up to real energy savings, and that's just one example of the kind of things we can learn from this hearing today. Imagine if every American decided to turn off their lights when they left a room, shut down their computers at night, or look for Energy Star labels the next time they shop for a major appliance. The truth is, U.S. households are responsible for more than 1/3 of annual U.S. energy consumption. Of that, approximately 60% goes into powering our homes, and the rest into fueling our cars and SUVs, though not my SUV. To put it in perspective, American homes consume 2.4 times as much energy as homes built in Western Europe, 2.4 times as much. A recent survey by the Alliance to Save Energy found that 92% of Americans agree that businesses, government, and consumers have an equal responsibility to reduce energy use. That seems fair, given that consumers use 1/3 of the energy. Unfortunately, this attitude is not always translated into action. The truth is that typical consumers don't have the information they need to factor energy use into purchases and behaviors, and the government and industry have fallen far short in providing or communicating the needed information to the public in a way that will result in behavior change. And I want to underscore the latter point. Merely giving information, but without cognizance of how the information will actually lead to behavior change, doesn't just do the job. A recent National Academy of Sciences report stated that, in quotes, a basic understanding of how information, incentives, and various kinds of constraints and opportunities in combination with values, beliefs, and social contexts shape consumer choice in complex, real-world contexts would provide an essential knowledge base for understanding, anticipating, and developing policies for affecting environmentally significant community or consumer behavior. That again from the NAS. While the focus of the particular NAS report was environmental policy, the statement works equally well for policies related to energy use, which is not only an environmental impact, but also economic and, frankly, national security ramifications. Our witnesses are working on different aspects of this exact problem. Together, they'll tell a story beginning with research into what influences individuals' energy-related behavior and ending with the relevance of such research to the development and evaluation of effective energy policies. When the topic of social science comes up, there are always vocal skeptics. We see them on the floor of the House, sometimes in this committee, and recently in the conference report on the America Competes Act. Those who may acknowledge the intellectual merit of the research but have trouble making the connection to areas of national need and question why the federal government should be supporting social science research in the face of so many competing demands for those dollars, I hope will pay attention to this hearing today. Today we'll learn how the knowledge generated by research in the social sciences is relevant to policy making for energy, but is no less relevant to every other major issue facing the country today, including health care, education, national security, crime, competitiveness, foreign policy, and the environment. We won't have hearings on all of those topics, but I guarantee you we'll have hearings on a few others and see how behavioral and social sciences can help understand these issues. I want to thank all our witnesses for being here today. I look forward very much to your testimony and our discussion, and I would now recognize the ranking member, Dr. Ehlers, for any comments he may wish to make.
I thank the chairman. I'm pleased that today's hearing will explore how energy-related policies are being shaped by social science research and also, I might add, by the behavior of people, which is what we will be studying. I understand that it is very challenging to determine why people do what they do regarding energy, given all the variables in their lives. If Congress creates what looks like good policy, but which lacks an understanding of the primary drivers of decision-making, our policies will still fail. We must account for social factors when crafting energy policies, and I will give a few examples in a minute. Much of the basic research funded by the National Science Foundation examined the fundamental mysteries behind brain cognition and human behavior. Among other things, NSF studies the causes and consequences of social and cultural norms. I know many of my colleagues share my personal interest in developing policies to draw more students into the science and mathematics teaching profession. In that context, I believe that it is integral that the social science research work in tandem with educational research to evaluate not only how to best prepare teachers to teach, but to understand what would draw them and keep them in teaching. Perhaps if we continue this series of hearings, we could delve into what incentives work best to encourage people to enter teaching professions, as well as their willingness to stay in them. I might also add, Mr. Chairman, we might also learn better ways of attracting students to study these particular areas of science and mathematics if we understood exactly what they and their colleagues were thinking, and also learn that this ensures their future better than most other choices they might. Returning to the topic at hand today, I'm particularly interested in what influences individuals to make energy efficiency decisions. We all assume that if people understood their return on investment from energy efficiency measures, say home improvements to save on winter heating bills, then they would quickly make those changes. But I think our witnesses will share that it is much more complicated. We are not always as rational as we'd like to believe. Furthermore, being well educated about energy efficiency does not necessarily translate into action. Consumers are a fickle bunch, especially in a society where individualism and personal freedoms are highly cherished, and certain unranked desires on the part of the consumer may guide the decision more than rational thought. Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to bring forward something that happened to me when my wife and I first got married and first went into a house of our own instead of a furnished apartment. We had to get a refrigerator. Not being an expert in what refrigerators are good for, what features are nice and so forth, I told my wife, you decide which features you want, and then we'll go out together and decide on the best refrigerator. She went shopping and came back, and she had found two refrigerators which met her needs, which she liked very much. I looked at them. One cost exactly twice as much as the other. Should make it a simple choice. Then and this was in the days before energy labels, but I proceeded to calculate the energy consumption of the two refrigerators and discovered, much to my amazement, that if I bought the more expensive one, I would have saved money within 10 years compared to buying the cheap one, because the cheap one used considerably more energy. So we bought the more expensive one, contrary to all rational thought. It lasted 23 years. So we not only saved more than the differential cost, but we actually saved enough to pay for a couple, more than two refrigerators of the other type. So those are the lessons that we should learn. We now have the labels, but again, I don't think the labels really make the picture clear. It would be much better if we could assign some sort of age to the refrigerator and have a notice on the front that says, this one will cost you X amount over so many years, and compared to other refrigerators that will last a shorter time. There are so many things that we can do about this that we should be doing. And you've probably all heard my I wish energy were purple story. Oh, you haven't? How did you escape? But basically that if energy were purple, people's behavior would change because they could see the results. In the winter, they could see purple oozing through the walls of their house if they're not well insulated, or purple rivulets around the windows and doors. And so they would seal those up more tightly. or driving down the highway, the Prius might be just a little purple haze around the car, but an SUV comes by, it's just a purple cloud. If people could see energy, if it were purple, they would change their behavior very quickly. The question, I think, Mr. Chairman, is how can we help them see the consequences of their decisions, even though we can't make energy purple? What way can we make this more obvious to them that it registers? But I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for investigating this important topic, and I look forward to hearing from our witnesses.
Dr. Ehlers, thank you. One of the things that is most pleasant, I think, about serving in Congress is when you can serve with people like Dr. Ehlers as your ranking member, because the example he cited illustrates that he's applied this in his life, and how many other Americans have the technological know-how as a PhD physicist to make those calculations. And that's the kind of thing we're going to be talking about today. So without further ado, I just want to thank my good friend Jerry McNerney for joining us today, also a PhD engineer, mathematician, but applied it to wind and solar energy for many years, so he knows whereof he speaks as well. If there are other members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. At this point, I will introduce our witnesses. Dr. Robert Cialdini is Regents Professor of Psychology and Marketing and W.P. Carey Distinguished Professor of Marketing at Arizona State University. Dr. Duane Wegener is a Professor of Psychological Sciences at Purdue University and an initiative leader in the social, economic, and policy aspects of energy use and policy division of the Purdue Energy Center. Apparently the Purdue Energy Center gets the concept to have you as part of the faculty. Mr. John Skip Laitner is a visiting fellow and senior economist for technology policy at the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy. Dr. Jerry Ellig is a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University and an adjunct professor at the George Mason University School of Law. And Dr. Robert Bordley is a technical fellow in the Vehicle Development Research Laboratory at General Motors Corporation and an adjunct professor in the Industrial and Operations Engineering Department at the University of Michigan, no less. Odd to my dear friend. As our witnesses know, each testimony is limited to 5 minutes each, after which the members of the committee will have 5 minutes to ask questions. We'll start with Professor Cialdini. Thank you all for being here.
Chairman Baird, Ranking Member Ehlers, and members of the subcommittee, it's my pleasure to be here today to testify on the contribution of the social sciences to the energy challenge. I believe that the social and behavioral sciences do indeed hold tremendous potential to influence individual and collective behaviors affecting energy conservation, providing that we understand how to craft the message. Here's why. It's standard practice when advocating for action among policy members, such as yourselves, to emphasize the breadth of a problem. And that makes sense because policymakers are able to provide additional resources or to enact regulations to address those abuses that they seem to see as most prevalent. However, a different and even opposite logic applies when communicating to the public about a problem. To understand that logic, consider the following incident. Not long ago, a graduate student of mine visited the Petrified Forest National Park in Arizona with his fiancée, a woman he described as the single most honest person he had ever met. They quickly encountered a park sign warning visitors against stealing petrified wood. It said, "Our heritage is being vandalized by the theft of 14 tons of wood every year." While still reading the sign, he was shocked to hear his fiancée whisper, "We'd better get ours now." What could have spurred this otherwise wholly law-abiding young woman to want to become a thief and to deplete a national treasure in the process? I believe it has to do with a mistake that Park Service officials made when creating that sign. They tried to alert visitors to the park of its theft problem by telling them how many other visitors were thieves. In so doing, they stimulated the behavior they had hoped to suppress by making it appear commonplace, when in fact, less than 3% of the park's millions of visitors have ever stolen a piece of wood. Although their claims may be both true and well-intentioned, the creators of this and many other types of public service campaigns have overlooked something basic about the communication process. Within the lament, look at all the people doing this undesirable thing, lurks the powerful and undercutting message, look at all the people who are doing this undesirable thing. And one of the fundamental lessons of human psychology is that people follow the crowd. I'm concerned that this point is being missed in our attempts to communicate the importance of environmental protection and energy conservation within our communities. Therefore, in our messaging, we need to be diligent in making clear to the public that many unwelcome actions with regard to the environment are performed by only a small minority of the population. My colleagues and I at Arizona State University have done research indicating that such an approach works. At the Petrified Forest, for example, we erected a pair of signs in different areas. The first urged visitors not to take wood and depicted a scene showing 3 thieves in action. After passing that sign, visitors became more than twice as likely to steal. Our other sign also urged visitors not to take wood, but it depicted a lone thief, marginalizing that behavior instead of normalizing it. Those individuals took only half as many pieces of wood as before. I believe that this lesson applies to other forms of environmental offenses, such as energy wastage. The secret is to avoid validating the deviant actions of a small minority of wrongdoers by making them appear the rule rather than the exception. Otherwise, we are sure that a few rotten apples will spoil the barrel. The truth is, we are not a nation of polluters or despoilers or energy pigs. We are not. Consequently, public service messages should raise the profile of the majority that does act pro-environmentally, because as social science research tells us, that spurs others to follow. To test this idea, we examined resource conservation choices made in upscale hotel rooms where guests often encounter a sign asking them to reuse their towels. This is the one at the hotel I stayed in a few blocks from here last night. As anyone who travels frequently knows, this card may urge actions in various ways. Sometimes it requests compliance for the sake of the environment. Sometimes it does so for the sake of future generations. And sometimes it exhorts guests to cooperate with the hotel in order to save resources. What the card never says, but is entitled to say because it's true, is that the majority of guests do recycle their towels when given the opportunity. We suspected that this omission was costing the hotels and the environment plenty. Indeed, when as part of our research program we placed such a sign in certain guest rooms in an upscale Phoenix hotel, it increased towel reuse by 34% over the traditionally employed messages. I'm going to close by raising 2 things that I think are noteworthy about the results of our towel study. First, the message that generated the most participation in the hotel's program was the one that no hotel, to our knowledge, has ever employed. Apparently, this highly effective appeal didn't emerge from a history of trial and error as a hotel best practice. Instead, it emerged from scientifically based understanding of human psychology. This points out the need for us to call on social scientific research in a systematic fashion to help advance sound environmental policy. For instance, in the case of hotel conservation, an average 150-room hotel would save 72,000 gallons of water a year. The second notable aspect of the hotel study was that the significant increase in program participation was nearly costless to the hotel, something that government needs to recognize as well. We don't need to institute highly costly fixes, technological fixes, or tax incentives or regulations. We can do it with the messaging process, costlessly. Thank you for the opportunity to provide the results of my team's efforts to date. I'll look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you, Dr. Cialdini. My guess is that the card doesn't use your effective message, right?
It doesn't. It says, please do this for the sake of the environment, and then it adds insult to injury by saying, don't forget to recycle. Every year, Americans waste 4 trillion documents, enough to paper the Grand Canyon 300 times. So they do the opposite of what our research suggests.
Dr. Wegener.
Chairman Baird, Ranking Member Ehlers, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify. I'm here today in part because the necessary transition from fossil fuels to new sustainable energy sources will rely on more than development of new energy technologies. A successful transition to new energy sources will be determined to a large extent by changes in the energy use behaviors of energy consumers. In my home discipline of social psychology, factors such as social norms, values, and attitudes have been identified as important determinants of behavior. However, these social factors are not always equally important. My research focuses on attitudes, persuasion, and the consequences of the resulting attitudes in terms of the persistence of the attitude over time, its ability to resist future attempts at change, and its ability to influence future thinking and behavior. As the charter for this hearing noted, there are indications that people hold favorable attitudes towards energy-relevant actions such as conservation. Yet, in too many circumstances, these attitudes do not seem to be having the desired effects on behavior. Why is it that these attitudes are not getting the job done, and what do we know about attitudes and persuasion that might help in making these attitudes more influential? The social psychology literature on attitudes has identified a number of determinants of when attitudes influence behavior and when they do not. Let me focus on one area of this research, the work on attitude strength. The concept of attitude strength came from the acknowledgement that not all attitudes are equally capable of influencing behavior. Many specific properties of the attitudes have been identified that make them relatively strong. In the persuasion experiments conducted in my lab, we focus on the factors that influence how much people think about the persuasive message. In some circumstances, people engage the message and think carefully about what it has to say. In others, they either lack the motivation or the ability to think carefully about the information in the message. In both types of situations, people can be persuaded, but the changes in attitudes created by thinking carefully about the message creates attitudes that have this property of strength. As one example, in a recent set of studies, a colleague of mine, Kevin Blankenship, and I took topics that people were not naturally motivated to think carefully about, including the topic of building nuclear power plants in Canada. And we asked them to think about whether that message related to values that we had previously identified as either quite important or relatively unimportant to our participants. When considering whether the message was related to these important values, message recipients thought much more thoroughly about the information using a number of different measures of amount of thinking. And just as importantly, the attitudes formed through thinking were then more capable of resisting a later message that opposed people's attitudes. In the nuclear power study, the later message opposed the building of nuclear power plants, where the initial message had supported the building of those plants. These thoughtful attitudes have also been shown in other research to be more likely then to guide later behaviors, even when the non-thoughtful attitudes were in fact just as favorable as those thoughtful attitudes. So if people are favorable toward energy conservation, for example, but their opinions are not well thought out, then these attitudes are unlikely to translate into energy conservation behaviors. Theory and research in attitudes has also identified additional factors that make attitudes stronger. For example, attitudes are stronger when people hold them with confidence, and the attitude is also strong if the person views the proposal, like the building of nuclear power plants, as mostly good or mostly bad, rather than as having a more equal mixture of good and bad features, which we refer to as ambivalence. In each of these cases, the attitudes with these properties are more likely to have the consequences that I mentioned earlier: persistence, resistance, and impact on behavior. There's certainly much more to learn about persuasion and about attitude strength, including, for example, which of the strength-related features is necessary or sufficient to produce the particular consequences, especially here to produce the desired attitude-consistent behaviors. Although I spent most of my time this morning speaking as a researcher who conducts experiments on attitude change, I also work within a multidisciplinary group of energy researchers in the Energy Center at Purdue University. The model in that center is to build connections among social scientists from different disciplines, psychology, economics, political science, consumer behavior, science education, and others, and also to connect those researchers with the technological development teams in bioenergy, hydrogen, etc. This integration of social scientists, natural scientists, and engineers is valuable in moving the issues of economic viability and technology adoption to the forefront of technology development. We believe that addressing the social obstacles that a new technology is likely to face will help to build new technologies that find viable markets more quickly and are therefore more successful. Both the basic research in social science and the integration of this science with technology development will be important in smoothing the behavioral pathways to a new energy economy. Unfortunately, both basic science in social psychology and policy and behavioral research on energy per se remains underfunded at the federal level. To conclude, the best new technologies will not help us to address the energy challenge unless the public adopts them. Therefore, the coming energy transition from fossil fuels to new sustainable sources of energy will consist in large part of behavioral changes. We'll benefit from greater research to understand these behavioral changes and to integrate this work with technology development. Thank you very much.
Mr. Wegener. Dr. Laitner.
Good morning, Chairman Baird, Ranking Member Ehlers, members and staff of the subcommittee. I recently joined the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy as their senior economist for technology policy. However, I'm now celebrating 37 years in the energy policy arena. And in those nearly 4 decades of effort, there have certainly been some disappointments along the way. At the same time, however, I have never been more confident in telling this subcommittee that the United States has never been better positioned to move onto a path of sustainable energy production and consumption, one that promotes both productivity and economic prosperity, if we choose to do it. But it's not really just about technology or economics. Rather, it's about the human element, the innovative spirit, and with apologies to my colleagues from the South, about our vaunted Yankee ingenuity. In that sense, a productive and prosperous energy policy equally depends on a better understanding of the human dimension. What is it that might be done to motivate that ingenuity, and what might be done to translate it into productive action? Let me give you a very concrete example. Some years ago, a colleague of mine had a really good idea for new technology, but in fact, it wasn't really a new technology. It was seeing a different blend of technologies, a new design, a new rearrangement of existing ones, a new configuration that, if implemented, would save manufacturers a good bit of money. Suffice to say that if my estimates are correct, then by 2025, the annual savings from this new energy-efficient technology would rival the anticipated output from the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge. It is potentially very big. So here's where the social science comes in. First, what is it that really motivated him to develop a prototype of this technology? Second, what gave him the inspiration to see a new way of doing things? Third, critically, why can't he get it to the market? He seems to hold on to it, always wanted to make just one more refinement. He doesn't seem to know how to really close the deal, and given the chairman's background, I think he might have some interesting insights into that kind of behavior. But fourth, how many more are out there just like him? I suspect a lot. And how many more could there be if we encouraged a greater entrepreneurial enthusiasm? Again, I suspect a lot. Fifth and finally, what can we do to motivate a greater level of innovative seeing, entrepreneurial action? This is all from the production side. There are similar questions from the perspective of the consumer. What is it that encourages early and then accelerated adoption of new technologies? We've heard a bit of that already. What does this tell us about the energy policy signal beyond the price signal? Mr. Chairman, I submit the energy problem is not purely a technology problem. While there's already a good bit of hard science involved, to be sure, and there is clearly a need for more research in disciplines like material science and advanced electronics, more generally in biology, chemistry, and physics. Fundamentally, I believe it is equally a problem with the human dimension. Yes, we are seriously underfunding R&D efforts, and especially for energy efficiency, but it is even worse for the social sciences. Members of this subcommittee may be interested in at least one set of energy-related statistics to help frame these last thoughts. Based on the 2007 edition of British Petroleum's Energy Statistical Review, it appears the U.S. enjoys what is referred to as proven fossil fuel reserves of around 130 billion tons of oil equivalent. That's good. At our current rate of consumption, that's roughly a 52-year resource. The bad news is about 90% of that resource is coal. But the good news is, in the spirit of Leonardo da Vinci's motto, sapere vedere, Tuscan dog Latin meaning to know how to see, we may also see something more on the order of 900 billion tons of energy efficiency reserves over the next century. As it turns out, we may use about two-thirds of this large efficiency resource in our normal pattern of growth. However, that would still mean an energy consumption about 3.5 times greater than we're using today by the end of the century. That's huge. Depending on how much of that energy comes from renewables or other clean energy resources, that may not be good enough. So the question then becomes, how do we unlock that remaining 1/3 of the efficiency resource so that we might keep our total energy use to, say, less than 50% growth compared to today's use of energy, and still maintain a robust economy? How exactly do we get at it? At a minimum, the answer is at least 1 part accelerated R&D and 1 part new insights from the social sciences, an expanded investment in our understanding of the human dimension. In answering this question, at least in part, let me finally turn to an analogy drawn from baseball. Pitcher Nolan Ryan was something of a hero of mine. He won, I think, 324 games over his career, which included a stint with President Bush's own former team, the Texas Rangers. But how many games would Nolan Ryan, the so-called Ryan Express, how many would he have won had he taken the field without his catcher or without his infield? In a very similar way, if we are to design and implement an energy policy that sustains our economy in a highly prosperous way, we should be funding and fielding a complete team effort. Yes, we need improved energy efficiency standards and smarter incentives. Yes, we need more research and development, but yes, we also need to support more research and more funding for that research in the field of social sciences. I thank you for this opportunity to speak. I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Mr. Laitner. Dr. Ellig.
There we go, Chairman Baird and Ranking Member Ehlers, member of the subcommittee. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Subcommittee in its invitation, asked me to address 3 questions, and it's hard not to address those without first saying a little bit about what I think economics is, what it can do, what it can't do. Since I'm an economist, that's what I was asking about. On the social sciences building at the University of Chicago is an inscription from Lord Kelvin that says, "If you cannot measure, your knowledge is meager and unsatisfactory." Now, there's an oral tradition that the late great economist Frank Knight passed down through some of his students, that the late great economist Frank Knight looked at that inscription and said something to the effect of, "Yes, and after you've expressed it in numbers, your knowledge is also of a meager and unsatisfactory sort." And the point is, I think, that the most important thing that economics contributes is an understanding of principles that help explain human behavior. Not numbers, not predictions, not even picking stocks in the stock market, although those are some things that economists do, but rather understanding some fundamental principles. And that's, the basis from which I'm talking today. The first question, and I'll paraphrase the questions to save time, essentially asks how predictive is a purely economic approach, and what factors other than price signals do we need to look at to understand human behavior? There's a syllogism that we use at the Mercatus Center when we're teaching congressional staff how to analyze policy, when we're teaching students at GMU how to analyze policy. It goes like this, and it's actually very similar to something that Mr. Baird quoted in his opening statement, that institutions in a society create incentives and knowledge flows that then guide human interactions that create outcomes. And we tell folks, if you understand that, you can understand the effects of policy. Now, that's a very broad statement, and it should be obvious from that statement that just doing economics doesn't answer all the questions we need to answer in order to fully understand that. Institutions may be formal, like laws and regulations, or they may be informal and more evolved, like culture and values and social norms. And there's an awful lot that economists certainly don't understand about where institutions come from, how they evolve, how they change, which things are durable, which things are not durable. They create incentives and knowledge flows. Incentives may be financial, or they may be anything else that motivates people to act. So I define incentives very broadly, even though typically economists say incentives and people think, oh, they're assuming people only care about money. incentives really in understanding human behavior, whatever it is that motivates folks to act. If you make it easier for folks to do something, they will probably do more of it. If you make it harder for folks to do something, they will probably do less of it. That's a more general paraphrase of the Economist lesson about prices. Knowledge flows. Knowledge is not necessarily information that can be chopped up into bits and transported. It's often tacit, which means individuals need to be able to act on knowledge that only they have, and different institutions enable individuals to use knowledge differently. And finally, outcomes. Public policy, we want to influence outcomes. The problem is the main thing that public policy directly affects is institutions, so we have to track how the institutional change works through knowledge and incentive flows to create outcomes. Now, why did I go on for a long time about this? Because it should be fairly obvious from that description that we need a lot more than economics to understand that. So, do we need all social sciences? You get a big amen from me out of that. Second question essentially asks about whether social science is having an effect on policy. I sure hope so, and I think we could probably all cite some very good examples. But I have to mention that in talking to folks in federal agencies, talking to congressional staff and others in this town, I also frequently hear comments like, I understand what you're saying about good public policy, but you have to realize we do stuff for other reasons than what you're talking about. And if Congress were to more clearly signal that it's actually interested in knowing about the actual results of policies that are enacted, putting clauses in appropriations, for example, that say this is the outcome we're trying to accomplish and this is how much of it we expect for this appropriation, I think that would send a positive signal that would help motivate federal agencies to make greater use of research in both the social and the natural sciences. Final question asked about what kind of tools and methods are most appropriate for understanding energy-related issues. My short answer, all of them. My concern, if I were overseeing federal research funding of social sciences or on a subcommittee that oversees the agency that oversees research funding, one of the most important questions I'd ask is the way we do this encouraging disciplines to use and look at a variety of different methods, or is it encouraging kind of a tunnel vision in which each discipline says one method is the only right way to do it? I know economists who are very close-minded who say that econometrics and statistics is the only way to get empirical knowledge. I've heard somebody who's an expert on program evaluation argue that only randomized field studies can generate useful empirical knowledge. Seems to me we shouldn't be throwing out any information. In conclusion, you get a yes out of me if you ask, are social sciences important? The only reason I think that we care about energy is because of what energy allows people to do. And so if the focus really is people, then we need social sciences to understand how energy policy affects people. Dr. Bordley.
Chairman Aird, staffers, I'm truly honored to present in this forum and also visit my parents. I was asked 3 questions. The first question was about describing the type of market research The first question I've looked at is estimating the change in product demand given change in prices. Although I have to agree with Bob that we've really
Here.
All right. As you can see, I'm not technologically fully equipped, to handle the sophistication of this committee meeting, but bear with me. All right. The second area I was focused on is grouping products into segments. There's an awful lot of products out there, small, mid-sized, large. The key question is, how do people perceive them? How do they group products together in their own minds? Do they group small products together? Do they group mid-sized products together? Do they group environmentally efficient products together? How do they actually group products together? And we want to try to look at products the way customers group them. So that's one issue. That involved a lot of psychological work that's been done on how individuals decide which items are similar. I've also done a lot of work about grouping customers into segments. For example, lower income people with large families, people who want some style but are price sensitive, people who want a vehicle that conveys status. This draws mainly on the socioeconomic literature about the different social classes in America, their needs for a vehicle, if they have large families, if they need to tow, as well as whether they view the vehicle as merely a means of transportation, an expression of personality or status, or something they want to enjoy. People are different. They have different needs during their lifestyle depending upon where they live, and that's important to understand. Modeling demand for products as a function of all of the attributes of the product: performance, comfort, appearance, price. Now again, this draws mainly on the economic and statistical literature. Modeling the decision process by which customers first become aware of a product, like how much can advertising affect their awareness of a product. And this work draws heavily on psychology. If you're not aware of a product, then you can't consider buying it. The second stage is how they come to seriously consider the product. Given the hundreds of products available, what are the simple criteria people use for whittling down the set of choices down to a manageable set of choices? Do they screen out vehicles with a poor image for quality, a poor image for environmental friendliness? How do they screen them down to their choice set? This draws on the psychological and sociological literature on how products acquire an image and reputation. How they come to shop for a vehicle. Do people visit a lot of car dealers or a few? How much does the increased availability of information on the internet affect the shopping process? This is an economic, psychological question. How they come to buy the product. What kind of product should a dealer have on their lot to maximize the chances of having what the customer needs? What kinds of financial offers are more attractive in sealing the deal? How should dealers determine how best to approach each customer, since some customers are very detail-minded and others are more holistically oriented? Some of these questions draw on economics, others draw on areas of psychology that are still being researched. Modeling the impact of advisor recommendations on the products customers seriously consider. Today, recommendations come from all sorts of places, from the internet, from Consumers Report, other magazines, auto magazines, word of mouth. This is still an area of considerable research by psychologists and market researchers. One of the big issues is what sources of information do people trust? What do they rely on in making their decision? Understanding the differences between work practices in different dealerships and how those different work practices lead to better or worse dealer performance. In this kind of problem, the dealership is often treated as a special culture, which is studied using methods adapted from cultural anthropology, and it's been very successful. Second question, what has social science revealed about the factors that influence an individual's vehicle purchasing decisions? What questions remain unanswered? A lot of the developments in economic and psychological methodology on models predicting individual choice have been central to modeling customer demand. The economist Douglas McFadden was very influential. He was awarded a Nobel Prize because of his central role in creating many of these models. The mathematical psychologist Duncan Luce received the National Medal of Science for his role in creating the building block that led to these models. These models are fundamental to what GM and what other car makers use in trying to understand the relative importance of different attributes to customers. We also employ direct assessment techniques for trying to assess customer willingness to pay for attributes, as well as for specific features like OnStar. And we do clinics, again based on the research in psychology and sociology about how to do clinics. The whole question of how the internet has reshaped the purchasing process is currently a very active area of research to which no one has yet developed a definitive answer. It's profoundly changing the market. Does the internet shape customer preferences to focus attributes that are more communicable on the internet, like cost and quality, versus less communicable attributes, like vehicle styling and the interior comfort? I myself have not specifically looked at the issue of fuel economy. How are recent breakthroughs in research incorporated into marketing or business, and what role might the NSF play? A lot of our previous models based on economics assumed individuals are rational. One of the real paradigm changes has been research in economics and psychology. The Nobel Prize winning work of Vernon Smith and psychologist Danny Kahneman, as well as Herb Simon, has strongly undermined that perspective and suggests that individuals are systematically not rational. We know basically how they deviate from rationality, and that's led to a whole effort of trying to rethink how we should understand customer behavior rigorously. And trying to operationalize that is still ongoing. We still don't understand that. There are clearly some success stories in industry collaboration. I mentioned the Edelman Prize at the Informs Conference as an example, showing successful applications. There are some non-successes. I think it's critical to say that NSF has been very proactive in trying to build bridges between the universities and academia. When I worked at the NSF in the Decision Risk and Management Science program, I basically was concerned with a program that explicitly had matching grants between NSF and industry to fund academic research. I was also involved with administering some of NSF's small business initiation grants. There's a lot of important bridges that NSF has built. Obviously, we can strengthen them and develop other kinds of things. For example, one of my thoughts is we might have a faculty in residence kind of program, in different kinds of corporations, because a lot of times the questions that industry people have aren't easy to formalize. If you have a acknowledged scholar there, oftentimes they can lend perspective, because you really oftentimes can't communicate your problem via an email.
Dr. Bordley, I'm going to ask you to wrap
Yes.
up a little bit. We're going to have a vote in about 15 minutes, so in order to make sure everybody gets to ask some level of questions, then I'm going to ask you to...
All right, that actually finishes my testimony.
Great.
A lot has been done, and NSF deserves high praise for what it has been done, but a lot more could be done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all our witnesses. I want to welcome Dr. Roscoe Bartlett to our panel here. Thank you very much, Dr. Bartlett. We've also been joined by Dan Lipinski. Thanks, Dan, for being here. I'm sorry, Dr. Dan Lipinski, thanks. One of the nice things about this committee is we actually have people who know something about science on it, which is a nice. Jerry McNerney's telling me he has to leave fairly shortly, so I'm going to yield my first 5 minutes to Dr. McNerney. First question. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have to say I found your testimony very interesting and stimulating. And from what it sounds like, we need to develop a herd mentality toward conservation and develop strongly held beliefs. Of course, this is something that we want to move toward in bringing conservation and good behavior about. Modeling is an important part of that. Could you tell me, Dr. Bordley, and maybe any of the other witnesses, what state are we at in terms of modeling behavior of society as a whole, in terms of directing behavior towards something like more conservation behavior or attitudes? Is that something we can get our hands around? Is that something we need to have more funding in to get more students involved in it, or where are we with that?
Well, right now, obviously, we've done a lot of modeling. For example, mixed multinomial and logit models to try to better understand customer behavior and make kinds of decisions. Obviously, we're clearly not exactly on the mark in predicting people's behavior as well as we'd like. You have big fluctuations, like oil price changes can come up and dramatically change the market. I mean, you can hit with curveballs. So, we have an awful lot of work going on the modeling. We are drawing on all the social sciences, and quite honestly, we're nowhere near where we'd like to be in terms of accurate models. We're a lot better than where we were 5 or 7 years ago, but it's definitely an area of current research, and we pay very close attention to the evolving social sciences to develop better models. Inputs to models are always a big issue, and uncertainty about inputs too. You don't understand all the things that are driving customer behavior, what kinds of search advisors they're looking at. So there's a lot of things that make modeling hard, as well as the proper assumptions to make about customer behavior, which is why the realization that customers don't follow economic rationality is such a big deal for us. So
one other question to give more time. The modeling is an important tool, but our influence in the Fed is also an important tool. How can we make policy that would influence the automakers or the other manufacturers to make the right choices? Because they have a lot of leeway in terms of how they direct customers. I mean, you see advertisements where they're promoting SUVs or big vehicle purchases. How can we in the Fed influence the manufacturers to make the choices to direct their customers toward conservation?
Well, I guess one of the things, unfortunately, is we found that, as I mentioned, the Internet, Consumers Report, whatever, increasingly people are looking to information sources outside of General Motors or the car makers in evaluating basically what kinds of vehicles they're going to buy. Consumers Report is strongly influential. Basically, you have Kelly's Blue Book, lots of sources out there. So advertising is still a factor, but it's nowhere near as important as it used to be. And we're finding to some extent that we're in a very competitive market. Things have just changed so much. And so,
I have an answer as well for that question, and that is in the messaging literature. In fact, we just heard about Dr. Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize a few years ago. His theory of prospect theory suggests that if we inform an audience what they stand to lose if they fail to move in the direction that we are suggesting, that will be more mobilizing than telling them what they stand to gain if they do move in that direction. So our message to the large automobile manufacturers can be structured and framed in terms of what stands to be lost, what will be missed if they fail to take the action, rather than what kinds of gains they will attain if they do.
Dr. McNerney, if I might, I am a modeler. I spent 10 years with the U.S. EPA doing modeling, and I left the agency because I think they're pursuing a very bad practice of economic modeling. Their models tend to assume, for example, what they call the full employment assumption. You may think it's jobs, but to an economist that means it's all resources, whether capital, whether labor or energy, are fully utilized and already efficiently allocated. So along comes Congress and wants to do something about climate or energy policy or national security. Their models, by definition, imply a net cost to the economy, because if we're already optimal, anything we do must impose a cost. But in fact, I think we would recognize that there are so many inefficiencies throughout the economy that if their models had a better ability to capture the technologies already available to us and the behaviors that could see a different way of doing things, a different way of innovating, a different way of adopting technologies, you might have a more satisfying outcome. And one of the things I think this subcommittee could do is send a signal to the economic modeling community, say, hey, there are better technologies your models are not capturing. There are better behaviors that you could be implementing, better policies than the price signal alone you could be incorporating in your modeling efforts, and you would see a much more satisfying end result. As an example, finally, modelers tend to use what we call a constant elasticity of substitution. You can imagine, invariant over time, the same elasticity, regardless of changes in perceptions, availability of technologies, changes of incomes. That is not a very satisfying way to provide you with the kind of policy insights you may require to know what better policies make sense for this economy.
We see that also in healthcare policy, dramatically illustrated there. Dr. Ehlers. Thank you.
Thank you. It's fascinating to listen to this and imagine what we could be doing. Of course, some folks would consider this mind control. I prefer to consider it as unleashing the mind, getting it away from built-in prejudices. But I'm curious, this is for all of you, what role do you see the federal government should be playing in changing consumer behavior, particularly as it applies to energy usage and dealing with the energy situation we have today? Any suggestions, recommendations, etc.?
I guess I had a thought that I raised with the chairman beforehand, which is you like to look for win-win situations, where the customer wins and the environment wins. One of the things people don't like are being stuck in traffic jams, and they don't like stopping or starting, at various traffic lights. And there is a continuing effort, in traffic science, this whole business about trying to help coordinate when people leave on trips so they avoid congestion and get to their routes more efficiently and more effectively. It's a win-win situation. The advent of the internet, which as I mentioned, is a real big, major deal, in the car industry, allows for a lot of more improved communication and coordination between individuals that allows them to, for example, avoid traffic jams, and spend less time in stopping lights and so on and so forth. The advent of technologies like OnStar that allow you to communicate with the vehicle likewise improves that. So there's an example, I think, of one thing that can happen to encourage that kind of coordination. So people, waste less time in traffic jams or at stoplights, and at the same time waste less fuel. Win-win for all concerned, using the coordination powers of the internet.
But if you succeed at that, then my method won't work. My method is to try to do what most people don't do. So I come to work before most people do, and I go home after most people do. That's not a very popular alternative, but it certainly gets me both ways much faster.
Well, see, that's where the social sciences really can come in, because obviously if we all do the same thing, we're all going to be in the same traffic jam. And so the question is, it's almost like auctioning, which is one of the areas of social science. You're almost auctioning off the space. Like, we can make agreement that, for example, the chairman leaves 10 minutes early for work, you leave on time for work, I leave 10 minutes later, we all avoid traffic jams. So some kind of coordination. Right now people loosely try to do that. We all leave early or whatever as far as that goes. But we can coordinate a lot more precisely with the internet. And it'll take some social science work on auction theory about how to do that. But that is one possibility, that technologically we have the technology to do it. But it's going to take the social science issues to figure out how to coordinate among us so that we can collectively reduce the amount of time we're wasting and the amount of energy as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Just any other comments about the role of the federal government in changing consumer behavior and energy issues? Dr. Wegener.
Thank you. Certainly when the federal government invests in research, there are a number of ways in which that research can make a difference in what you're describing. Certainly investing in basic research can provide tools for individuals like Dr. Laitner described, where they have a product but haven't brought it to market, haven't found ways to make it work. And basic research that may be across many different content domains, health, energy, other types of topics, can provide tools for those companies, for those marketers and such, to take a good product and make it work in the marketplace. Certainly, the model that we use in the Energy Center where I work as well is that in the technology development itself, it's a different kind of perhaps research investment. It may be for interdisciplinary teams and such rather than the basic work, but that can help those technology developers to identify and address online and upfront what those public obstacles may be, and that will pay dividends down the road in the same places, but deal with it before there's a product and marketing after the product's been developed, but deal with it before the obstacles are encountered.
Dr. Ellig?
Two quick suggestions. One thing the federal government could do is take a careful look at institutional barriers that might be thrown up by other levels of government in some cases. For example, if I go home and look at my electric bill, the price that I pay for electricity tells me it doesn't matter when I use it. Whether I use the washing machine or dishwasher at 5 o'clock on a July afternoon or 2 o'clock in the middle of the night in December, doesn't matter. And there's some significant rigidity introduced by the way that electricity has traditionally been priced in the U.S., which pretty much, in many cases, discourages people from shifting their use to off-peak times and doing things that would be energy efficient. And there are some experiments out there, both laboratory experiments and experiments in the real world with real consumers, that show that when people have the opportunity to pay a price that varies based on market conditions, they actually do alter their behavior and move their use to off-peak times. The other thing, just thinking about the traffic issue and having spent some time in the federal government in a management position, to the extent that federal agencies can better define what they are accomplishing in terms of outcome for the public and then link the performance evaluation and compensation of employees to that, it's easier to let people work without much supervision, which means it's easier to keep people productive when they're telecommuting. I happen to work at an institution where we're completely evaluated based on what do you accomplish, not when are you in the office, how much face time do you have with relevant people. Having been in the federal government, I know that the idea that you would evaluate people based on what they accomplish rather than face time, time in the office, number of hours, is foreign to a lot of folks even. And it's because of a tremendous focus on trying to measure outputs and inputs rather than actual results.
And in many cases, it's hard to measure either one.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. We face a somewhat similar challenge here in Congress to the issues we're talking about, vis-a-vis trying to involve social sciences more in the policy making and actually gain respect for them. In the halls of Congress, when it comes to NSF funding, we've had some interesting battles about whether social science should somehow be a second-class citizen in NSF funding. I'm interested, Dr. Wegener, in you're in an institution where they've specifically apparently incorporated that, and so my question would be, how do the physicists, the engineers, the others interact with you? Have they come to see the value, or do they say, oh, God, now we got to go talk to those social scientists and pretend we care? And so I'm interested in that. Then I'd be interested in any of your comments for how your disciplines and the insights from your disciplines can help your associations and those of us who care about social science convey to our colleagues the importance of this endeavor we're talking about. So first, Dr. Wegener, and then open it up.
Yeah, so I deal with those issues every day now, it seems, in terms of, and with mixed results, I'd have to say, that for some of our scientists and other parts, the technology development wings of our Energy Center, they absolutely understand the need for issues like attitude change and consumer behavior. Although you might be able to predict that some of these areas, for example, in the area of biofuels, where some of the technologies that are being developed would include genetically modifying cellulosic feedstocks for biofuels, for example, have already noticed resistance from environmental groups and others about that kind of technology. And so they understand that there's a human social aspect to the technology development itself, and so they've been eager to talk with us about those issues. You might also imagine that folks that study nuclear power, for example, who know that there are social pressures and opposition in some cases to that technology, are certainly interested to talk with us. In some other areas, we're just not really on the map for those scientists yet. Although I have not, I would say, met a lot of real resistance to talking about those issues. But I think our successes have been varied and in some predictable ways for technologies that for which they already notice that there is that social issue.
I've had success with my colleagues in the natural and physical sciences by validating the worth of their efforts and suggesting that what we can do is assure that those efforts will be implemented and adopted as a consequence of the hard work that they've done.
If I might respond, Mr. Chairman, as an economist and a modeler, I think the best way to begin is that Kenneth Boulding, American economist, once commented that images of the future are critical to choice-oriented behavior. If the modeling doesn't allow different images to unfold in the way we might deploy technology, the way we might involve other kinds of policy than a mere very high price signal, then we may not see any kind of reaction because we're hesitant. We think we're going to end up with nothing but a penalty. If your model assumes that a $100 investment in a new refrigerator is a pure cost, as opposed to an investment with a return on it, you get a whole different set of results. So we're trying to work with sociologists and others to understand that we can shift perception on the innovation side and that we can shift perception on the consumer side in order to facilitate an adoption of a technology. So rather than this idea of the constant elasticity, behavior that never changes regardless of the size of the price, the severity of the problem, always the same behavior, we're trying to dissolve that and to show that there are ways of incorporating different behaviors that do result in a positive and a net benefit to the economy.
If I would apply that argument along with the kind of comments from your colleagues to the right, that might be the kind of argument we could try to help our colleagues here understand, that the efficacy of the investments in the physical and engineering and mathematical sciences will be enhanced, not detracted from, by an investment in the corresponding social sciences. That's exactly right. And I think that's then incumbent upon the social sciences themselves to demonstrate that in some fashion.
If I can also speak, I've basically, I've sort of worked on both ends. I've been most of my work in modeling, but I've also worked on the other end, where you're actually trying to put stuff together and everything else like that. Vehicle development, or when you take a new technology, basically, trying to build a vehicle or any complex system is a very complex coordination system among lots of different individuals at various kinds of levels. It's a massively complex kind of thing. Individuals have different kinds of incentives, this whole project management kind of thing. You're talking about thousands of people, basically, getting down to the actual guys who basically, screw on nuts or whatever, take things apart. And I've been in both worlds. And I think that's an area, technology transfer. It involves people ultimately. We can get distracted about these kinds of things and directional things and saying, here's a great new technology. But translating that into a product that can actually be built, cost effectively and made into the market by real people, that's a lot of very social science, kind of interaction, very complex. And at least, in my mind, basically, that's not an area we shun at all, because that's clearly a big issue. So I think it's a very clear area.
Dr. Ellig?
Yeah, I think graduate education plays a big role in how people develop attitudes toward other disciplines, toward other tools, and so forth. And so to the extent that we can get graduate level education for social sciences and natural sciences to help folks appreciate, the other methods and what the other disciplines have to offer, there's probably a big payoff there in terms of creating a body of people who are then predisposed to work with scholars in other disciplines and use other methods rather than saying, oh, well, we're the only ones who really understand the world.
I appreciate that perspective. In fact, the America Competes Act and the NSF reauthorization bill that Dr. Ehlers and I worked on does a number of things to try to encourage interdisciplinary research. Dr. Bartlett.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for arranging for this hearing. I think that the social scientists in our energy future will have the biggest challenges and perhaps the most responsible position. There are three groups that have common cause in wanting to move from fossil fuels to alternatives. You've been mentioning just one of those groups, and that's the group that believes that our use of fossil fuels is increasing CO2, which is changing the climate and resulting in global warming. There are those who will argue that if you look back through the past, you will see that, as a matter of fact, the CO2 increases occurred after the global warming, therefore the result of global warming, not the cause of global warming. There will be others who will argue that the Earth at one time had been very much warmer. There were, as a matter of fact, subtropical seas in northern Siberia and the north slope of Alaska and so forth, or else there wouldn't be gas and oil there, right? There will also be others who will argue that, a warmer Earth wouldn't be all that bad. If I'm living in Siberia, you'd have a hard time convincing me that a warmer Earth would be all that bad. And so you have the problem of convincing everybody that this is something that we need to bend our energies to, because they may argue that the Earth is warming and we had nothing to do with it. So the Earth may be different, but it won't be necessarily worse. So it's going to be hard to marshal everybody to follow this drummer. The second group that has common cause in wanting to move from fossil fuels to alternatives is a group that believes that because we have only 2% of the world's oil and use 25% of the world's oil and import almost 2/3 of what we use, that this is a totally unacceptable national security risk, and we really got to do something about that. And what you need to do, of course, is move from fossil fuels to alternatives so that we are less dependent on oil. And if we have only 2% of it and use 25% of it, we need to change that. Not everybody will agree that this ought to be a priority that would result in them changing their lifestyle, because they will argue, gee, we think that if we just had better dialogue with those Arab nations, they'll play nice, and the guy who has the dollars buys the oil anyhow, and it really won't matter that we don't have the oil because it's out there in the world and it's a global economy and we'll have the oil. There's a third group, little mentioned but growing in recognition. That's the group that believes that the energy is just not going to be there. In 1956, M. King Hubbert predicted the United States would peak in 1970, right on schedule. We peaked in 1970. By 1980, we absolutely knew we were sliding down the other side of Hubbert's peak, and our response to that was to drill more. Totally the wrong response. For the last 30 months, oil production worldwide has been constant. By the way, I noticed that several of you were referring to EIA. Please have a lot of reserve in of confidence in what EIA is telling you. They're a bunch of economists who are predicting that if you understand the past, you can predict the future. And they are exactly right. If our resources are infinite, they are not infinite. In 8,000 years of recorded history, we're about 150 years into the age of oil. Best evidence is that in another 150 years, we will be through the age of oil. No more, for all practical purposes, no more oil, gas, or coal. What kind of a world will our great-great-grandchildren live in? So you have a huge challenge in marshaling people to do the right thing, and I think that properly articulated, it is undeniable that oil is not forever, that we will reach a peak at some time. I think the evidence is pretty much overwhelming that for conventional oil, we've already reached that peak. We're now static because we're having some unconventional oil like Alberta tar sands and really heavy sour oil that we're exploiting today. So absent national leadership, we don't have much energy in this country. We have even less responsible national leadership. Absent national leadership, what can you all do so that we move along the right path?
Well, Dr. Bartlett, if I might lead off, there's a fourth group I might add to that list, and that's a group that says between now and, say, the year 2030, this nation will absolutely have to invest literally trillions of dollars in new energy supply, infrastructure, highways, buildings, and that if we're going to have to make that investment anyway, why wouldn't we want to ask the question, what is the smart mix of resources that best get the job done, that satisfy multiple concerns? Whether you believe in climate, whether you believe in peak oil, or whether you have other concerns, why wouldn't we want to put all of our resources, energy efficiency, nuclear, hydrogen, renewables, unconventional fossil fuels, get them all on the table, do an honest assessment of their cost and their performance, see which blend, not picking winners, but generally what direction we could move in as an economy and satisfy those concerns by then incorporating both the hard science and the social sciences to help address that very difficult question. We're either going to lock in a hard future because we're not making a smart decision about the investments today, or we're going to open up opportunity for some innovation, which I said earlier in my opening remarks. We have the means to move ourselves into a solid economic prosperity and a sustainable path if we choose to do it, but that requires taking the field with a full complement of players and really addressing the issue up front.
I'm glad that Dr. Bartlett raised this issue because certainly we have folks within our Energy Center that are also careful to say that we're talking about a limited and polluting resource, and that limitation is important. I do have an economist colleague at Purdue who says, well, we'll never actually run out of oil, not because it's not limited, but because it will become so scarce, it will become so expensive that to use it that people won't anymore. The problem is if we wait until that point where the economics alone push us to do other things, our economy will have taken so much of a hit already that we will not want to face it. And so it's important for us to be proactive and to work ahead of that eventuality rather than to wait for it.
Yeah, I think we probably have to have a big dose of humility in speaking about how we, whether it's us experts or lawmakers or regulators or anyone, is going to shape things to deal with things that could happen in the future, and appreciate that there are very real limits to either what folks like us can know or to, frankly, what folks y'all can accomplish through law and through regulation and so forth. And so we should just be careful to realize that any time one of us says something must be done, or any time one of us says, here's what the problem is, that's reflecting not just maybe some technical expertise, but also a set of value judgments and some assumptions about the future that may or may not be right.
Those bells you hear, those of you who are social scientists remember Pavlov's dog. We now have 15 minutes to get to the meat. And so that means that our final questioner will be Dr. Lipinski, and I very much appreciate it. And we'll finish after Dr. Lipinski. And thank you very much. If people leave now, it's because they're going to vote. It's not they're being in the room.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, we have plenty of time since the 15 minutes is really more than 15 minutes. So, but I won't go on that long. I want to thank Chairman Baird for holding this this hearing today. I am a social scientist. I was teaching political science before I was elected to Congress. I also have a background. Before that, I was an engineer, and I studied an interesting program called Engineering Economic Systems at Stanford, and had Amos Tversky as a teacher there also. So all of what you said is very interesting and very important for our understanding as we here as we work on creating public policy to try to get the outcomes that we'd like to see. There are so many factors that go into what those outcomes are going to be. There's so many different directions I could possibly go, but let me start with a more general question and something more specific. My first question is, I know Dr. Ellig had talked about graduate level education is so important in terms of really teaching graduate students that interdisciplinary work is important and it's good. I'd like to know anyone who has what their view is right now of how much incentive there is right now among scholars doing social science to actually do interdisciplinary work. Because certainly as a political scientist, I did not see a whole lot where I was at in my experience, but I know it differs by institution. But overall, do you see there being that much incentive out there to do that kind of work? Is that rewarded in any ways in academia? And it certainly seems like it's rewarded out in out in industry. Anyone who has any comments on that?
Dr. Lipinski, I might open up because we have seen that unfold with our forthcoming conference in November in Sacramento. Apologies, it may not be in your district, but the Behavioral Energy and Climate Change Conference that is being convened, and I have been stunned, and my colleague, Dr. Karen Earhart-Martinez, with me here today, has been even more so because she's been fielding an incredible number of questions from a multidisciplinary field across all parts of the country, people really wanting to see more of this interdisciplinary approach and incorporating the social sciences into the thinking about energy policy. So I might comment that that convening of the conference on a shoestring budget has brought forth a really unprecedented number of inquiries and interest to see not only in terms of policy, but the question you ask, which is, what kinds of interdisciplinary actions can occur? And the good news is I'm learning about even more. I did not know this. I did not know about Dr. Wegener's efforts until this testimony here today. And we're just learning about Bob, who's, I'm delighted to say, is going to be one of the speakers at that conference in November. So the good news is it's almost as if it's been under a pressure cooker. There's people just churning to wanting to get out and be much more involved in an interdisciplinary way, but not having the means to do so, both the funding and the connections and the infrastructure to make that possible. But that's starting to happen. I think you're going to see a lot more compelling interest in that kind of a direction.
I think at least in economics, the incentives facing the more junior untenured professors are still to publish in the top journals by doing the things that economists are normally expected to do, rather than doing a lot of interdisciplinary stuff, unless the interdisciplinary work involves some new type of neato-technical technique, because then it can get into the top journals where technique is prized very highly. And so I think where you've seen economists doing good interdisciplinary work is when either in unusual cases where there is a particular academic department that explicitly decides it's going to be different, and I have to say my colleagues at George Mason University comprise one such department, or where there is some sort of an institution on campus that's explicitly designed to promote this, like the center Dr. Wegener is with, or once you get up to the Nobel level and other situations where more senior scholars aren't subject to some of the more mundane incentives of their discipline, then they have a lot more freedom to kind of go out and and follow wherever the path may lead.
I'm very happy to hear that the disciplines are moving that direction, but what Dr. Ellig said certainly was my experience in political science in terms of what was, as a junior scholar, was what was valued. And I certainly think that we need, for the sake of the social sciences and for the sake of helping our country and our world move forward, interdisciplinary work is certainly very necessary. And I always look back, and this is a much more general factor that influences people is the way that they are brought up. And I always say I'm a child of the 70s, grew up in the 70s, and energy, saving energy and the environment were very important and showed up so much in popular culture. And as a kid, I grew up with those things. They still are with me today, and I see that as one factor in influencing my behavior. But I wish we had more time, but I think that that's going to be it. But I'm very interested in all of your research and what we need to do and what the factors are that influence people's work. It's up to the chairman.
If I could say very briefly, I think that in a lot of places that there are not the incentives that there could be to encourage this kind of interdisciplinary work. People are largely doing it out of their own desires rather than incentives to bring them there. But also I think it's really important for us to strike a difficult balance between that interdisciplinary work but strong training in disciplines that people can take to those interactions, and that's always a difficult balance to find.
I want to thank our panelists. As a way to close this, Dr. Laitner, I'm going to give you one opportunity for the shameless plug for this conference, because I think it is absolutely the perfect sequel to this hearing itself. Tell us about the conference very briefly, and location, time, and date.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Yes, it's a conference entitled the Behavioral Economic Climate Change Conference, designed exactly to bring together the panoply of disciplines, whether anthropology, sociology, psychology, economics, in a way to see what might be done to provide a more satisfying understanding and movement towards a prosperous energy policy, one that addresses a number of these concerns. In Sacramento, November 7th to 9th, in my testimony, I do give the URL and other information.
Terrific.
But thank you.
What's the URL?
Uniform Resource Locator, the website.
No, I know that. I mean, what?
Well, apparently not communicating. My apologies.
No, I'm sorry. I mean, I know what URL is. I mean, what is the URL for the conference?
It's on the ACEEE website. If you go to www.aceeee.org, you'll find it there.
That's all right.
Thank you.
That's pretty good. You appreciate the normal ignorance of members of Congress, and I can't fault you for that. Let me thank our panelists and my colleagues for a very interesting hearing, all of those who helped us put this together. With that, the hearing stands adjourned, and I thank everyone for participating.